Hello again. So today we're going to be doing a little bit of Aristotle, and we're going to do a little background, and then we're going to talk about some of the metaphysical stuff that you need to know about to be able to know about, well, it's ethics and many other things. Um, so this is going to be reasonably short, and I do actually mean it this time. All right, so let's start off with Aristotle, who was the student of, should be easy for you to know, Plato, written right there. Yeah, okay. He studied in Plato's academy from 366 to 347 BCE, so something like 20 years he spent in his academy or his school of sorts. I mean, it took me a decade to get my dissertation written and get my Ph.D. or my doctorate, so it's not as though that seems too odd to me. I mean, like, how long do you spend in school for most of your life? You know, your 12 grades plus kindergarten, maybe VPK or something like that, plus 4 years of college if that's what you're doing right now, or 2 years if that's what you're doing right now, or you know, much more if you're going to go for an MA and then a PhD or something like that. Okay. So at any rate, Aristotle, not an Athenian. He is not actually from Athens, unlike Socrates and Plato, who were both citizens of Athens. He is actually from Macedonia. Both of his parents were Macedonians as well. They were doctors to the court of the king, and Aristotle got a good education as a result of this and became a philosopher, and famously tutored whom? Does anybody know? Well, the answer is Alexander the Great, and it was fabled that he had Alexander the Great on his conquests send him back a piece of every flora and fauna that he encountered. So what that means is flora is like just your plants, and fauna being your animals. So he had him stuff and send it to him, and preserve plants and send it to him. Supposedly, we don't know if any of that's true, but Aristotle basically was the first person to try and gather all of the known knowledge of the world and write it all down. It's pretty impressive how much he wrote and on what. I mean, he has a book on physics, metaphysics, ethics, politics, poetics, analytics, which is basically logic and categories. He's got a book on biology. He's got a book on the psyche, or the soul, or the psychology, depending on how you pronounce or want to talk about that. He's got a book on the animus, or the soul again, but that which animates us. We'll talk about that later today. And also a book on rhetoric, which we may have talked about earlier too. And also a book on animals, and a book on, oh God, like just about everything. So pretty much he gathered all the knowledge he could and put it together and tried to tell it. Also, if you're reading this, some of the reasons that it's bad is perhaps due to translation from the Greek, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. We don't have any of Aristotle's works for a reason that I'll explain in a minute from their original writing. The originals in the ancient Greek were all destroyed. We had lost those to time. In fact, what ended up happening was, so after Alexander the Great dies and his empire starts to crumble, which leads us into the Hellenistic age or whatever, they bring charges against Aristotle, since he's not an Athenian and he is teaching at a school, which he founded, called the Lyceum in 344 BCE. Why did he found the Lyceum? Well, the reason was, after Plato died, even though Aristotle was his best and brightest student with the most potential, and pretty much one of the only people that we know from that era that continued on. I mean, there were academics that were actually quite famous that came after him that were in the academy. But they give the job to Plato's nephew. So nepotism, of course. It's not what you know, but who you know, as always. Things have not changed all that much. Regardless, so he starts his own school, the Lyceum, in 344. And then eventually, when Alexander dies, the people in town don't like this foreigner teaching them all sorts of weird things above the earth and below the ground or whatever. And Aristotle actually is doing some of that. He actually makes claims to knowledge, unlike Socrates and whatever the heck Plato is up to. Because again, like I had said before, I'm not sure exactly what Plato is actually saying, because Plato never speaks, right, in his dialogues. He just has other people say stuff, and we're supposed to gather from that what Plato may have meant or intended, and that's kind of weird. So at any rate, they bring up charges of, what do you think? impiety and corrupting the youth, just like they did against Socrates and Anaxagoras before him. And does Aristotle defend himself properly in court this time, unlike Socrates? No. Aristotle says, I will not let Athens sin against philosophy a second time. So he skedaddles and decides to escape to an island in the Cyclades, which is in the middle of the Aegean. Well, not exactly the middle, but, you know, off the coast there, somewhere in the middle of the Aegean, or edge, like closer to Greece than it is to Turkey. But at any rate, he catches cold in the next year or so and then dies. That's just how it goes. People die from catching cold. If you ever had a pretty bad infection when you were a kid and you didn't get antibiotics for it, you just might die. So at any rate, you know, we're living in a pandemic right now, so that's kind of the case. Probably before this whole thing's through, you know, I don't know, we're sitting in the almost 200,000 range-ish probably at this point, I'm not sure. But if we can get up to 350, 360, you know, 1,000 deaths, that'll be like, you know, 10% of the population, which is pretty good given, you know, the Black Plague only killed a quarter of the population of Europe at the time. So, I mean, you know, 10% versus 25, that's doing pretty good as a plague is concerned anyways, but not to be worried. So, at any rate, yeah, so he was in Athens in its peak in the 4th century. Again, the reason why it's the 4th century, even though it's 300s, is because we're counting down to 0 here. And to understand what's going on with his ethics or basically anything else, you've got to understand his physics and his metaphysics. The 4 causes, or the B-causes as your books are calling them, or book, depending on what you are something like this. And this is going to be important for understanding sort of what's going on in general. And without this, the ethics make less sense. So here we go. So the 4 causes or becauses. When we ask the ontological question, and what is ontology again? Think about it. Should be the study of being, right? What is in some way. Because again, being could be a lot of different things. It could even be nothing, depending on how we're defining nothing, right? Because technically there is no nothing, according at least to Parmenides and also Hegel and a number of other people. But again, it is a concept that we have, so it's something maybe, possibly. But at any rate, so, you know, when we asked what something really was, Plato said, oh, look to the forms maybe. But as I pointed out in an earlier video, it's dubious at least, or possibly unlikely that the forms were actually Plato's real philosophy. I think he uses them as a propedeutic or a learning tool or a pedagogical tool, or just, you know, something to teach you how to think philosophically or something like that. And as a result, we get people saying that Plato says that there are forms and everything shares in these forms in themselves. And then later Plato, we have a turnaround where he changes his mind on this. And it's like, well, maybe, but really all this shows is that in the early Plato with Socrates, he brings up the forms a lot more. And we never really get an answer as to what, you know, the form of beauty is, or the form of justice is, or the form of piety, or any of that stuff. So what we end up with instead is, you know, him asking a lot of questions that end in aporia, or an aphoretic dialogue, which, as we said earlier, means it's a dialogue or a place that ends in aporia. And aporia is a perplexity, a puzzle, or more literally, a stopping point, a blockage in the road or somewhere else, or a general lack of provisions, a point at which we cannot carry on any further from. So when we get to a point where we can't fight the argument anymore, we call that aporia, that moment aporia, or we call it an aphoretic dialogue. We've come to the end of the road and we're just going in circles now, or something along those lines. All right. So back to the causes here. So when we ask what something is, instead of it being the really real in the realm of the forms outside of the cave or something like that, what we end up with instead is something a little different. Aristotle says there's not one answer to the what something is question. There's actually 4 answers to that question. And they are these. So one, he says that there's a formal cause. Your book starts with material. Technically, when he writes it out as material too. Oh, there we are. That was, so getting back to an earlier digression about why this is hard to understand or read. So we lost these things because after Aristotle fled, they burned all of his books, and the only people who had copies of his books were the Persians. So the Persians preserved Aristotle's works and translated them into their language and other languages. And then we get those translated from Persian back into, I think, Latin or Greek, and then from there into, or ancient Greek, into English. So what we're doing is playing like a 2,500-year-old game of telephone where somebody told somebody else what they were saying here. And furthermore, even worse, we think that all of the written work that we have by Aristotle weren't his actual, because they claim that he wrote dialogues. We have none of those. But what we do have of his, we claim were lecture notes from students. God help me, and God's help me, Zeus, Vishnu, and the rest of them. If I ever had to be remembered by only my lecture notes. I mean, these things right here are terrible. They're handwritten, some of the parts, and there's only snippets of other parts. I write a paragraph here and there. It's not good. Aristotle had similar issues with the run-on sentences, if you noticed, but that's kind of a Greek thing anyways. There's lots of diagrams, he says, that are going to be there, but they aren't there. So lots of people have actually written whole papers on what these diagrams could look like. But none of that's important. What is important is, though, that you need to know that these are not even technically Aristotle's words, but they're pretty close, because the person who's a note taker, unlike you likely, isn't just scribbling stuff down quickly as they go. They would have a professional note taker in their class, standardly speaking, a slave, to take notes for them while they listen to the person who's lecturing, usually Aristotle or some other professor or teacher or whatever. So you would have, your slave note taker and then you watching, and then you go over your notes later. And then you would, check to make sure that you had all the notes properly later, perhaps with the professor. This is not the time where you ask questions of your professor or your teacher. In this era, what you do is you take the knowledge in and you listen, okay? We'll talk about how this changes with modern philosophy later. At any rate, so when we ask what something is, the being question, the four answers are: one, formal. And again, this is the second one that he goes through in the book, but in the physics. This is from the physics, by the way. But it doesn't really matter. They all work together in the same sort of way. I mean, having the final end be the final one you do is usually correct, but if you guys, perhaps for a test, need to know this, order doesn't matter. Okay, so what are the essential qualities of the thing? And when I say essential, I don't mean like essential oils. I mean like essential as in the essence of the thing. What makes it the thing that it is and not something else, right? So what makes the thing that it is and not something else? What makes it essentially that instead of accidentally that? So, for instance, it's essential that humans have hair. It's accidental what color it is or how much of it we have. It's essential that we have eyes, but what color we have and what kind of stuff that's going on with them, that's accidental. When I say accident, I don't mean whoopsie. The word accident actually comes from the word something that's not necessary or something that's not essential to the things, which is sort of where the word accident, what whoopsie or I had an accident with my car comes from. It's not necessary that that's supposed to happen. In fact, it's not supposed to happen, right? Even though according to the DMV, you're 100% likely at some point in your life, if you're a driver, to get into an accident, at least one, bender at least. So at any rate, I can't possibly imagine that's true, but I mean, I have, but 100% is just way too high a correlation, standardly speaking. Still, so what makes a thing the thing that it is and not something else? So let's say that we're talking about a chair. That's one of our standard items that we talk about. So what are the essential qualities of a chair? Well, it's got to have legs. Otherwise, it's not a chair. It's like a beanbag or something like that. If it only has one leg, then it's a stool, right? If we have like a thick stump and, we just sit on it, that's a stool. It's not a chair. It's a different sort of thing. It's a sitting thing, but it's not a chair per se. So you have to have at least two legs, because there are some chairs that just have the two sides, going up, and then the seat and then the back. And that gives us the other two things that a chair needs, is a seat and a back, right? Armrests, not necessary. Those are accidental qualities. They're inessential, right? it's essential that a chair have a seat, otherwise it's not a chair, right? If it has legs and a back, maybe we'll call it a toilet. I don't know. A hole, something odd like that. Armrests, not necessary. Cushion, not necessary. You can have hard wooden chairs if you'd like. You do have to have a back. Why do you have to have a back? Otherwise, it's a stool. Once again, we're back in stool territory. So you got to have a back, you got to have a seat, and you got to have legs, at least 2. Could have 3, could have 4, could have more. I mean, my rolly chair has, I think, 5 little swirly legs on the bottom of it. So, you know, I would call this a chair that I'm sitting in currently, even though it also has armrests and this little pillow thing in it, which is actually bothering me because of my hat. But at any rate, it also technically, though this is new in a certain sense for me because I had been teaching this for years, and then finally somebody came up with a new quality other than legs, a seat and a back. The other thing that it needs is to be taller than it is wide, or else it becomes a couch or a futon, right? So, or a bench, something along those lines. So that's what makes a chair. And if it has one solid base and a back and a seat, then it's like a throne, and that's a different sort of chair-like thing, but not a chair. So for a human being, again, some of the formal qualities are like skin, eyes, teeth, hair. And for Aristotle, if you lack any of these things, let's say that you are lacking hair, like you have alopecia or something like this, or you're born without eyes or something like that, Aristotle would claim that you are a deficient form of a human being. Now that might sound rough, mean, or harsh, but he's just pointing out that there is a form that humans and chairs and everything else has as a standard, and there are deficient members of that class of chair or human or marker or eraser or whiteboard or whatever, right? And they can work better or worse. A chair that's wobbly, that doesn't sit still or straight, is a deficient one. A table that also has one leg that's off and you got to shove like a coaster under it or something is a deficient type of table, because a table's supposed to be steady and straight, right? A knife that's dull is a deficient knife. It's not fulfilling its purpose properly because it's supposed to be sharp. That's what a knife is, right? That's its essential quality. Okay, now, so we can also have formal stuff that doesn't include that doesn't include material stuff like ideas. So for instance, if we talk about God will claim is perfect, right? Immortal, yeah. Those are usually the only 2 things that we definitely give to God, because God might not necessarily be all good, might not necessarily be all knowing, but will at least say perfect, which generally includes all knowing and all good, but we'll just say perfect, and infinite and immortal, right? But not material, because if God was made of matter, then God would break down, because even in Aristotle's time, they noted that as things wear or age down, entropy occurs, or things start to break down over time, and eventually even God would have to break down if God was made out of matter or something like that. Humans break down over time too. I mean, we are all degenerating and regenerating at the same time, constantly. Every 7 years, every single cell in your body has died and regenerated completely, and slowly you will eventually die due to just natural causes, and all things will rust and rot and degrade as time goes on, right? The ever-present flux or becoming of things, as we may have talked about earlier, or you read about with perhaps Heraclitus or something like that. So the material cause is what it's composed of. For my chair, it's plastic and leather and metal, and I think that's probably it. Could be wood, but what it's composed of is the material can vary, but the form has to stay the same, right? Humans are made out of cartilage and bone and keratin in your fingernails and your hair, right? And a bunch of other types of cells and stuff like that. So that's what material we're made out of, mostly water, right? And the efficient cause, which is the one most people forget, this is very important. This is what brings it into being, what makes it, what is its proximate mover. So, proximate mover, what the hell does that mean? Well, this You've, I'm sure, heard of the word approximate. So it's approximately right now 4:40, which means I don't have very much longer for what I'm planning to do for this lecture before my office hours. So it is actually 4:42 technically. So that's proximate time, exactly 4:42. It just clicked over. So what the proximate mover is the exact mover. Approximate means roundabouts, close to, approximately close to. It's not exactly. Proximate means exactly that which brings it into being. The proximate mover. So for the chair, for instance, it would be a craftsman, or more likely, probably a machine that crafted it in a factory somewhere, right? And maybe you, like for instance, I had to assemble this chair because it came in the mail in a box that was like this thick, and you had to put all the pieces together, and it was really big and really long. But at any rate, so the proximate mover was probably likely a factory and myself. Your parents, for you, as well as the food you eat, the water you drink, the air you breathe, all of those things are being imbibed and brought into your body to make you continue to be, and bring you into being, to carry on through your becoming as a person. So what we have is the proximate mover for humans is a combination of things, like your parents and, again, all those other things that play into it. It's not necessarily just one thing. And when we have proximate movers, we have causation going on. And Aristotle very much believed in causation, like all the ancient Greeks pretty much, save for possibly the Epicureans, but we'll get to that later, not today and not this lecture. But there was no free will at this time. So if you read anything that looks like it's talking about free will, it's not. That doesn't come up until at least the early Hellenistic era with the Epicureans, but probably not really in any robust sense until we get to the Christians in the Middle Ages. Before that, there's nothing really strong like that. The Stoics don't even really have freedom because they believe in fate, but we'll talk about what they mean by free or freedom and what Aristotle means by that too at some point perhaps. But listen, the idea of freedom, as in like I can free will move my hand or something like that, is not a real concept in the ancient Greek world. The idea would be all of your atoms, and they meant atoms in its smallest indivisible parts, would be moving based on earlier interactions in such a way that you were going to move your hand regardless of what was happening. The fates, if you were religious, were spinning out your thread, and that was them doing the movement for you until they snip it and then you die. There is a fate for all humans, and this sort of thing is very, very important for them. So what's important here is that there is a proximate mover and then there's a chain of proximate movers, because every so like for instance, there's a cause, right? Then there's an effect. But for every cause, right, that cause is technically the effect of some earlier cause. Let's say cause subprime 1, right? But that cause technically is actually just the effect subprime 2, let's say here, now it's effect subprime 1, of some earlier, right, cause subprime, let's say 3, which is actually technically the effect of cause subprime 4, and this goes on and on and on and on ad infinitum, right? So is it going to be an infinite regress? Is it going to be circularity? Or are we going to have a first principle or an axiom as our final answer? If you read my introduction to philosophy, it's there. And if not, then there are only 3 answers that we can ever finally achieve. And it's either axiomatic or first principle, meaning this is the end of the line. There is nothing behind this. This is an unsupported foundation. Also notably in the movie WALL-E, the ship that all humanity has got on and is now floating around in space on, is called the axiom, the unsupported foundation, right, of all of humanity. It's actually a lot deeper movie than you think. And it's also like, the axioms for Euclid, which I may have talked about earlier, like for instance, parallel lines never intersect. You say, sure, that's obvious, but you've never drawn out lines to infinity to show that they don't intersect, but you have to just accept that to be able to do any geometry. Otherwise, we can't get very far in geometry. But in Rhombian geometry, or Rhombian space, they do intersect. In fact, we don't live in flat Euclidean space. What we do live in instead is curved space, space-time, right? If with enough gravity, say a black hole, we might actually have parallel lines intersect. We don't know, because we don't know what happens in a black hole, which is technically just a supermassive star that is shrunk down to a very small size, but it warps space and time because of the gravity that it has. So once we get past the event horizon, we can't see what goes on inside or on it or near it, but parallel lines could possibly intersect there. Again, we don't know, but still, we just have to accept that for Euclidean space to work at all. So any geometry you've learned is Euclidean, just by the way. And Euclid, of course, being one of our early Greeks. And Aristotle goes with a first principle or an axiom, much like matter and energy are what we think in physics are the basic units of whatever. There is, I can ask you what everything's made of, and you can say atoms, but I'm like, well, that's not the smallest part because there's electrons, neutrons, protons, well, then quarks, and those are made up of smaller things, possibly, but we don't know what. So we have given up on the idea of the smallest indivisible part, so we don't really believe in atoms, literally atoms as in smallest indivisible part anymore. We just think that eventually all ends up being energy or matter, and possibly dark energy and dark matter, but we'll leave that aside. That's more physicsy stuff. So even if we want to say Big Bang and then cause, effect, chain of events, chain of proximate movers, all the way to the end here, we still have to have a beginning. And Aristotle chooses that beginning to be God, or as he calls it, the unmoved mover, that which moved all things and is unmoved by anything else. It is the ultimate, or, supreme mover of all things. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But first, we're going to finish this up with the final cause, all right? The telos. The telos. This is important. Your book may have talked about this some too, with telemachy and teloses and the way that things are going to unfold in a certain sense. Flourishing is my favorite Greek translation of this word, because telos, much like a lot of the other Greek words that are polysemic, like logos or pathos or just about any of them, telos can mean flourishing, it can mean end, it can mean goal, it can mean aim, it can mean purpose. Most translators like to call it the purpose. I think that that is a little overblown, because it's not necessarily a purpose for something, it's a flourishing of something more often than not. But purpose is a totally reasonable definition for telos, or final cause. It's completion, it's full fruition, these sorts of things. So when we ask, what is the flourishing of a chair? What is the end of a chair? What is the goal of a chair? The aim? What is a chair's purpose, or its completion or full fruition? Well, it's when it's being sat in, or to be sat in. That's it. And for a frog, it's to be froggy, and for a knife, it's to cut well, right? If it's not cutting well, it's not fulfilling its purpose, it's not doing its aim, it's not completing its end, it's not flourishing as a knife, right? So what is human flourishing? What is the human goal? What is our purpose? What is our end, our completion, our full fruition? Because, this is philosophy, so I assume at some point, we've got 10 minutes left till my office hour, so we're going to end this one a little bit short, probably. Still, we're going to get to God. We've got 10 minutes left. So here's the deal. What is this goal for man? What is the purpose set before us? What are we all living for the sake of? What is the for the sake of which that all the for the sake of whiches are for? Because, why are you watching this video right now? Or why are you in school right now? So you get a degree, so you can get some money, so you can learn some stuff, so that you can get some money, so that you can be secure and safe and, I don't know, get a car and a house and a white picket fence and have some kids and blah, 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 blah. Well, why do you want all of those things? Eventually you end up with happiness, because we want all other things for happiness, but happiness we want for itself. We also want virtue for itself, according to Aristotle, but virtue contributes, and he says is the main contributor to happiness. So when we talk about this, happiness, okay, I'm going to erase this now. The word happiness is kind of a misnomer, or an incorrect way to translate the word for this in the ancient Greek. There's actually a couple of words in ancient Greek for happiness, but the one that Aristotle's using is eudaimonia. All right. So eu means well, good, or great. And daimon, as we talked about for Plato and Socrates, means spirit or soul. There's other words for soul as well, but we'll just go with it for here. So to be eudaimonic, to be happy, is to be well, great, or good-spirited, or souled. To be ensouled well, to be happy is not happy today, sad tomorrow. No, for Aristotle, this is an activity of the soul in accord with virtue, completed over a lifetime. So it takes a long time, and you never know that you're actually happy until the end. Because fate and fortune can ruin your happiness, like they did for Priam, king of Troy. He, was a great man that we know of, was very virtuous, raised a bunch of good kids, except for Paris, who ended up stealing the queen of Sparta named Helen of Sparta, but then Helen of Troy. Oh. And the Spartans didn't take kindly to that, so Helen was the face that launched 1,000 ships. The Trojan War came to his shores. They had a war for 10 years, and then they busted inside, burned, looted, pillaged the place, raped his wife and daughter, threw his baby off the side of the wall, and then murdered him too. It was a pretty bad ending, so we wouldn't call his life happy or eudaimonic, even though most of it was good and happy. What you're thinking of is probably more like joy or pleasure, because you can have a pleasant day or a joyful day, but not happiness. Happiness for Aristotle is a much more robust concept, so even using the word happy is kind of weird. Well, my happiness is different than your happiness. It's like, no, that's not what Aristotle means. That short definition I just gave you is what Aristotle means. An activity of the soul in accord with virtue. Now, why eudaimonia? You might want to think of other things like eulogy, right? So eu being well or good or great, and logos being a speech, an account, a discourse of some sort. So a good speech or a good word or a good account or discourse on somebody, which you would tell at their funeral, right? That's what we call them eulogies, right? In the ancient Greek time, they had dislogies as well, which before you were buried, they have a dislogy and then a eulogy. The dislogy would be they'd roast you, basically. They'd make fun of you some, and then they'd finish with saying nice things about you. Then the Romans said, never speak ill of the dead, and then it was just eulogies from there on out. Or euthanasia, again, you being good, and Thanos being not just a titan from the Marvel Universe, but death. So a good death, or a mercy killing, or merciful death, or euphemism to say something nicer or more well or good or better than it actually is, or all sorts of different U words. You guys can come up with them, I'm sure, on your own. But at any rate, so happiness is very different. And essentially, he's going to say that it has to be the case that we want to be happy because we don't want that for other things. It's a silly question to ask. Think about it. What do you want happiness for? You don't want money just for the sake of money. You want money for what it gets you. Money is a means to an end, not an end itself. Happiness is an end in itself. Unless, of course, for some reason you've got some weird money fetish and you just like want to roll around in it or like swim in it like Scrooge McDuck or something like that. Money isn't something that brings you pleasure. It's the stuff that money gets you that brings you pleasure. Right? Even if that's just prestige or the idea of having it hoarded, that's still a pleasure from it, not because of it's not the money itself, right? It's like your experience points or something like that. I don't know, whatever you want to call it. But happiness, again, for Aristotle, not this sort of fleeting thing, and it's not something that you can have from screwing people over and being vicious and evil. Most of those people report not being very happy, and as it turns out, the richest people self-report being some of the most depressed, most miserable people. In fact, those people that are screwing people over and getting great joy in the kill or whatever, or in screwing people over or whatnot, they tend to be pretty miserable human beings. My father was a used car salesman for years before becoming a real estate agent. And I said, so you definitely, because my dad's actually a pretty good person as far as those folks go, and he's a man who lives and dies by a deal, and his word is his bond and stuff like that. So he would send people away if they were going to get a bad deal, or send them other places if whatever, the sort of like Macy's Santa Claus type deal thing, from Miracle on 34th Street. But he's not, because there's obviously the caricature of the sleazy used car salesman, and my father was not sleazy but was a used car salesman nonetheless. I asked him, so you had to know some sleazy used car salesman is like, oh yeah, I knew total scumbags. They lie to everybody about everything. We're going to throw in free snow tires and undercoating. Oh, I'll go talk to my manager to get a better deal and never do that. You know, all this sort of nonsense or whatever that people do. And he said the people that really tried to screw people over, he said, generally were drug addicts or alcoholics or just standardly very depressed people, even though they got a little enjoyment or pleasure out of screwing people over or getting a little bit of money or whatever that they did, but they were standardly not happy. And even if you don't feel feelings right, like say you're a sociopath or a psychopath or like a serial killer like Dexter in the show Dexter, I think it's a Showtime show. It's also a book series. Only watch the first 2 seasons, they're the best. After that it starts getting a little less good. But at any rate, you know, he's never happy. He pretends to be happy. And many of the people that are sociopaths feign emotions and feign empathy or pretend like they have it because it makes it easier for them to get along in society. Otherwise, they end up in prison pretty quick or in a mental institute pretty quick. I mean, that's why serial killers get to be serial killers, because we're pretty good at catching killers. But if you're very good at pretending to be normal or happy or whatever, then that makes it so that you can continue to murder people. Right? Otherwise, you only get one and then they catch you, right? So at any rate, the point being is that when it comes to happiness and virtue, they're intertwined. You're supposed to, there's a simple question that we need to ask. Are you happy when you do good things? Hopefully, yes. Are you sad, or does it hurt, or do you regret when you do bad things? Hopefully the answer is yes. And if not, then you didn't really think it was bad. You're just saying, oh, that's bad. No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying if you really know it to be a bad thing, a vicious action, then Aristotle says that that comes with pain and regret. And he says that vicious people standardly can't make proper friends, like the complete kind that he talks about much later in the book. He spends 2 whole books on it. He says that the vicious man cannot form lasting friendships because he only loves what he shares with the other for a time, not for the person himself. So they can't really have complete friendships. So, and Aristotle says that you need to have at least one complete friend to be happy. Happiness is an activity of the soul in accord with virtue, completed over a lifetime, with at least minimal external goods, because he says if you don't have at least one good friend, which is the best external good, right? Unless your friend is your imaginary friend, but I'm not going to count that. And, you know, a little bit of money, roof over your head, you know, stuff like that. If you don't have those things, he says you're not flourishing, so you can't really be happy. You know, I always have somebody every semester that's like, well, you know, down by the VA center, I seen this homeless vet with no legs and says he's happy because he found Jesus. And I'll say he might think that he's happy, but in the Greek eudaimonia sense, he is not flourishing, okay? That is not flourishing, and he is deficient in many ways, according to Aristotle. Not me. I'm not saying that you can't think that he can't think that he's happy or whatever. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying in the Greek sense of happiness, of flourishing or fulfilling the purpose of mankind in a certain sense of being human, which is to reach your telos, happiness. That's not it. He also says if you're born severely deformed or super ugly, not going to be able to be happy. If you're without children, you can't be happy. So probably never going to happen for me except for by accident. Let's hope not. Okay. So carrying on, we've got other things that you need to have. No great calamities or tragedies happen to you. So you can't be Priam again, like the King of Troy, or you can't have all of your family members die, or have or be like raped and beaten as a child or something like that for you to be happy. The show Hoarders, the show Intervention, and the show My 600-Pound Life, or any of those shows about those sort of people that have really destructive life habits, almost all of them have standardly some sort of great tragedy or great calamity that happened in their life that made them fill that hole or made them try to numb themselves or kill the pain with drugs and alcohol or with food or with things, just stuff piled everywhere. The drugs one, occasionally you have somebody that got into a car accident or some sort of other injury, and then they started prescribing them pain meds, and then they got hooked on pain meds because it's very easy for people to get hooked on pain meds. I personally haven't been hooked on pain meds, but as a person who has had kidney stones, which are extremely painful, they say the most painful thing a man can undergo and the closest thing to childbirth that a man can experience, I have been under the best drugs that our society has to offer in, hospital conditions. Been on fentanyl, which is 100 times stronger than morphine, because when they gave me the morphine, it didn't do anything for me, and I was like, what? I thought morphine was going to be good, but no, it didn't help with my kidney stone. Then they gave me the fentanyl, and I was still in a little bit of pain, but I was feeling good. And I know why people get addicted to those drugs, because it feels really good, but they're really bad for you, like super bad for you, so that's why you shouldn't do them. But nonetheless, the point that I'm trying to make here is that for Aristotle, we have to be flourishing to be happy. And that includes a life of virtue, because you feel good doing virtuous things. People tend to like you more when you're a virtuous person for the most part. And you aren't vicious, so that means you don't hate yourself. He says vicious people hate being alone, and they are alone a lot. And part of the problem is that they spend time thinking about the vicious things that they've done and the vicious things that they're going to do, because they know themselves to be a vicious person. And if you don't know that you're a vicious person, then you're probably a sociopath. And once again, you're probably not going to be happy, right? So this is the deal. You got to be able to have at least minimal external goods. You got to be virtuous, and virtue is the one thing you actually control, because the external goods, he says, you might not be able to have friends, or all your friends might get killed, or something like that happens. You might have tragedy befall you. The fates might not have it in for you, and fortune might ruin your happiness, right? And you might be born deformed or a slave or something like that. According to Aristotle, you're just not going to be happy if you're born a slave. And again, remember, in Aristotle's time, a slave isn't like chattel slavery before the Civil War in the South. A slave is someone who got paid a very meager sum of money and could generally buy their way out of slavery if they saved up enough, but usually you could never save up enough money to buy your way out of slavery. It was very uncommon, and you had to be very good with your money to be able to do that. It's basically like having one minimum wage job. You're like always one, accident, tragedy, broken appliance, sickness away from you not being able to pay for anything anymore, and you're busted broke again. So this sort of cycle of poverty that goes on keeps you enslaved to a system of poverty and essentially being yoked under wage labor that is very close to the type of slavery that they had in ancient Greece, except for your master. You don't have a master who could kill and rape and beat you at will, or sell you however they felt like. So, there are the perks to having sell your labor instead of, being a slave. However, being a slave, we'll get into this later, but it's capitalism is why we don't have slavery anymore, because it's inefficient. It's way more expensive to have slaves and take care of them than it is to pay them not enough money to live on and then say get another job. But nonetheless, flourishing, which is probably why you're here taking this class, so that you can get a job, so you can be above minimum wage, making greater money, so that you can be happy, right? They have a J curve that they did a study over, sorry, not a J curve, like a bell curve that they did a study of recently, where they said that if you make like no money down here, right, then you're very unhappy. And up here at 70K, $70,000 a year. Now, this is about 5 years old, the study, so it's probably a little more than that now. That's money can buy you happiness to that point. After that, there's a steep drop off, and the most rich people are actually oftentimes the least happy. This ended up going, this is such a convincing argument that a tech guy out in Silicon Valley decided he was going to pay everybody in his company, janitors to middle management, $70,000 a year. Middle management was pretty upset. The janitors were very happy. But again, in the Aristotelian sense, he's teaching to the youth of Athens, and they are not working. They probably have their own slaves to take notes for them. And he is saying, if you don't need to make money, how are we going to be happy? And virtue, he claims, is how you're going to get there, because the rest of the stuff is kind of up in the air. Also, he has three chosen modes of life. one being the life of pleasure, the bon vivant, if you will. And he says that that's animalistic and bestial. And if we're nothing but beasts like that, that's not going to make us really happy. So if you just look at like super rich people that do nothing but like, have sex and do drugs and go out on yachts and stuff like that, it might seem like a good time, and it probably is for a while, but eventually that stuff gets boring. Desire, desire, more and more and more, and it's never fulfilling. So it doesn't actually end up being like that. And besides, would you trade your life as a person with intelligence to be a cow or a house cat that's pampered? Please say no. And just have some dignity. And then he says there's the life of politics, and politics generally as in social or political, politics in its broadest spectrum. So you do social work or politics, which are similar things. And super rich people oftentimes have charities that they run to try and help the world, or they try to become president because they think they can help the world like that, regardless of how you feel about the president. He's thinking that he's helping, whatever you think, however. But that's what wealthy people do. They run for office or they run charities. Bill Gates has huge charities. Oprah has huge charities. These people try to better the world, socially speaking, or politically speaking, or both, because Aristotle claims that man is a social, or man is a political animal, the anthropos politas, right? So the political animal. But at any rate, the final one is the life of contemplation or study, and he says that is the most self-sufficient, requires the least out of you, and you can do it the longest, because the life of politics gets ruined by dishonor and bad reputation, and that just comes with time. I mean, probably the reason Hillary Clinton didn't get elected last election was because she'd been a politician too long. After that, there's just only so long you can be in politics before you're just dirty everywhere. I mean, not to say that Trump isn't dirty everywhere too, but not politically speaking and actively politically speaking. So, and again, that reputation that you have may or may not be true, but it doesn't matter. Reputation is not up to you. Maybe a little, but your reputation can be sullied by actions of others that have nothing to do with what you've done. But contemplation, you can do it a long time. I know a lot of philosophy professors and a lot of other professors that are well past the age of retirement, and they continue to teach because they find and write because they find great happiness and benefit and pleasure in this profession. Now, we don't get paid a shit ton. We get paid something close to, if you're getting a full-time job, this 70K-ish range, low six figures. I think some of the more well-paid people at USF and HCC get paid a couple $100,000 a year. The president of the university makes like a lot more, but we're not going to go into that sort of thing. And people like myself, right down here in the minimum wage zone. They pay me literally, if I work 8 classes a year, I make, assuming that 4 classes a semester is a 40-hour work week, which believe me, it is at least that. I will be making roughly $16K a year-ish. So for fall and spring semester, and I try to work summers, and I also try to work at other schools, so that way I can cobble together a living that's better than literally minimum wage, because I'm not a full-time professor. I'm an adjunct professor, which are most of your professors at HCC. Actually, most of the classes are taught by adjunct professors, and the vast majority of professors there are actually adjuncts. While roughly 50% of the classes get taught by full-time people, there are like 3 to 1, maybe 4 to 1 people that are in my position as an adjunct instructor or professor as compared to the full-time people. Now, is this the best way to get the best education? Is this going to provide the greatest happiness for our society? Probably not. But again, we're just talking about ethics here, and to be the great soul man, the great spirited human, if you will. But Aristotle does actually mean man. He doesn't think women can properly be happy. He's sexist in this sense. He says women can be clever, but they can't be smart or something like that. I apologize. I'm just going to go out and say this because Aristotle is sexist, and he defends slavery because he says that if people can't manage their money properly, they should be slaves. That way that someone can take care of them in such a sense that they don't have the problem where they don't have a roof over their head or food in their mouth or taking care of their children, because if there's slavery, then at least they have that minimum taken care of. Ooh, I'm not going to defend that, but some people actually do make that argument to this day, that like people who are like super poor and on welfare are basically, either enslaved to the government, or they should just be, treated as such. I don't think any of that, but
just saying. Nonetheless, that's where we're going to end the lecture here, or I might continue this in a bit and talk about God and the soul for Aristotle, because those are very important concepts, but we're going to pause here for a moment because this is all my whiteboard can take.
Okay, and we're back. So, we were talking about Aristotle and the four causes last. We left off here. So there are four causes. The formal cause, right? And that is the cause that is what makes the thing that it is and not something else, right? So like for a chair, legs, a seat, and a back. Could have multiple legs of many varieties, could have lots of different types of backs or seats or cushions, but it has to at least have legs, a seat, and a back. Humans have all sorts of formal qualities like hair and eyes and limbs and fingers and noses and whatnot. Otherwise, we're deficient versions, like a chair lacking a leg. Material, what the thing is composed of, what it's made of. For the chair, wood, metal, plastic, whatever. Efficient cause, the proximate mover, which we'll get back to in a minute. What exactly moves it into being, or what brings it into being from its becoming. For the chair, the craftsman, or the factory of me. For you, your parents, and the air you breathe, the water you drink, and the food you eat. And then finally, the final cause, the telos, the flourishing, the purpose, the end, the goal, and the aim. Okay, now let's talk about the soul, and then we'll get back to God. So, sorry about this. Let's see if I can make that happen. Okay, there we go. So, my writing kind of always slants this direction. I can't help myself. Okay, so when we talk about the soul for Aristotle, this is not like some sort of free-floating spirit like you might be thinking about, as in like your soul in the Christian or other sort of religious senses. That's like a spirit that goes around and leaves your body, or maybe you think your consciousness or something like that, or your mind, or something along those lines. This is not what it means for Aristotle or even the ancient Greeks prior to him. For the most part, I mean, there is, of course, the religious understanding of when you die, you go to Hades and with your soul, and that's what goes there, and it is sort of that spirity thing. But for Aristotle, it's not like that at all. And even the Homeric Greeks, in a lot of ways, thought that perhaps when you that your soul was the fluid, your spinal cord fluid. And they said that your soul leaked out of you when somebody took an axe to your spine in combat, because that white fluid that leaks out stops you from moving completely. You're paralyzed, basically. And I thought that was your soul leaking out instead of spinal fluid. But the idea of the soul, and one of the books that he has on the soul is called De Animis, literally what moves you, what animates you. The other one's the Psyche, which is also translated as the psychology, and it's also the word where we get the word psychology. And psychology is, in a certain broad sense, at least as far as the Greek word is concerned, what moves you or sways you, or the psychology of the person. Go and talk about like psychologists or criminal psych evaluations or whatever. They're trying to figure out what motivates them, right? So the soul is literally almost a physical thing, but for Aristotle, it's literally the only things that can move you to action or activity. And activity is important. This energeia or kinesis, this movement, this is where all life is basically spawned from. The more active you are, the more alive you are, right? And even the word, the slang word for sex is kinesis or movement, which you might think of like from physics, kinetic energy or something like that. But at any rate, Aristotle's the first one to come up with this idea of materiality, let's say, as a basic component of everything, and also this energeia or kinesis. But the ethos of the soul has two parts: the rational part, or the logos. That's literally what we call it. We start referring to it as reason here with Aristotle. And again, that's your discourse or your reasoning or your rationality behind something, or your word, or the thoughts in your head or something like that, right? We'll get back to that in a second. And then the second part is the irrational part, which this is sort of like Socrates, or at least the one depicted by Plato, because Plato says that there's a tripartite soul, not a dual. And he says that there's, it's like driving a chariot where you've got you as the helmsmaster with the reason or the logos, and then there's appetite and spirit that are your two horses that you're trying to keep in line. But for Aristotle, not Plato, he says there's only two parts, the rational and the irrational. And the irrational breaks down into three parts, which is the vegetative or nutritive. It depends on how you want to translate the Greek for this. But this is also where we get the idea of a vegetative coma or a vegetative state, or what vegetables or plants can do. They can grow, they can move towards light. Sensitivity plants can shrink in on themselves when you touch them. I mean, even things like Venus flytraps can, snap shut and close on flies and other insects and things like that. So, I mean, plants can move, but you wouldn't consider them intelligent or having a logos or rationality or reason. Much like a person in a vegetative coma doesn't have logos going on, at least as far as we can tell, although the word coma is very vague. I teach biomedical ethics as well. There's no real good definition for what a coma really means. You could be moving around, you could be motionless, you could have brain activity, you could have no brain activity, you could have only some STEM activity. It's all very different. But if ever you're in a situation where you have to deal with comas and you want to know how dead the person really is as far as all that's concerned, if it's an anaxic coma, meaning that they lack oxygen to the brain for more than 5 minutes, that's a kind of full brain hit that is very, very hard to come back from, and like no one after 3 years has come back from one of those. If it's a trauma-based coma, like you took a hit to the head somehow, then there's good possibilities within the first year to 5 that they might come back with decent, and decent is me being nice, like sort of recovery. The recovery can be very good or like functional-ish, sort of like having a serious stroke or something sometimes, or worse. I mean, the person who was in a coma the longest that came out of one doesn't remember anything prior to the coma. Still thinks that was 17, even though he's like in his, I want to say like 40s or 50s, and he didn't remember or recognize anybody or anything really. He was practically a child as far as his mentality is concerned. But regardless, what I'm saying is animals and all sorts of other things have vegetative parts. You don't have to think about your fingernails growing, right? You don't have to think about your hair growing. You don't have to think about digestion. You don't have to tell yourself to breathe. I mean, you can actually have some control over that, but that happens naturally as a basal metabolic function. Vegetative part of the soul is just the stuff that happens naturally for you. When your muscles break down from exercise, and then the lactic acid goes over the muscles, and then burns them, and then they reheal stronger, and etc. You don't think about any of that stuff. That's not up to you to do, or it doesn't spur you to activity. That's just there, happening in the background. Now, spirit and appetite, or the spirited part of the soul and the appetitive part of the soul, on the other hand, do motivate you to action or activity. The spirited part is kind of weird. We don't have a proper English definition exactly for this, but it's sort of like passion. But the best English sort of words that we have for it are like team spirit. I've got spirit. How about you? Right? That sort of thing. You watch a football, baseball, or whatever sports ball game you're into, and these people are very far away from you, either in a stadium or nowadays, or usually on your TV or computer or phone or whatever, or on the radio, who knows. And you listen or watch, and then all of a sudden there's this welling up within yourself. There's this feeling that you get to move you to jump up and down and scream and shout and yell and cheer for your team or whatever. And that's spirit, or in the military, what they might refer to as esprit de corps, like the spirit of the military, what motivates you to jump out of the foxhole and try to charge forward towards the other trench, or save the other person or something like that. Courage is very strongly related. Courage is a virtue, but it's very strongly related to the spirited part of the soul. And also, anger is the quintessential spirited sort of thing. If somebody's hitting on or trying to make a move on your significant other at a bar, let's say, and you want to like go over there and like get aggressive because you're jealous or something like that, or you want to like punch them in the face or something like that. That's the spirit welling up within you. If somebody embarrasses you and that feeling that comes over you that makes you want to become violent, that's the spirit coming over you. Your spirited part of the soul, or your instinct to flee, the fight or flight mechanism, basically, sort of stuff. Pretty much anytime your adrenaline kicks in, that's the spirited part of the soul, if you will, to give it some biological sort of correlative nonsense. But he thinks that that can motivate you to activity, right? This sort of like anger or passion, or that sort of thing. The spirit of the people or the time or something like that. And then appetitive, or your appetites, are pretty closely arranged with your desires. Like I have an appetite for food, for water, for sex, drugs and rock and roll, or whatever, and that moves you to stuff. So for instance, I'm thirsty right now, so my appetite is moving me towards this canteen of water so I can drink this. So my appetitive part of the soul has guided my hand to this canteen of sorts to drink from. And now I am sated, and I'm going to continue talking. My appetite might be for sex, so it might move me towards talking to someone who I'm attracted to at the bar or grocery store or wherever you meet people these days, I guess. I don't know. Online, whatever. Or, you have an appetite for hopefully knowledge and learning and health, right? So you learn about those things, and you've been motivated by your appetite for such things. And those are good appetites. Not all appetites are bad or bad for you. I mean, again, the appetite even for sex is there for procreation, which is good, you're supposed to, and yada yada. Your appetite for food is good because it keeps you alive. For water, same thing, right? But too much of any of these can kill you. Even water. Having too much water in your system can cause a electrolyte imbalance and will kill you literally. A couple people a year usually die from this while either hiking or in basic training in the military because they overhydrate or something along those lines. Sometimes runners will do the same thing. They'll just have way too much water and then they'll die from that. You can literally, which seems weird, but it's true. I mean, like gallons of water you'd have to drink. But at any rate, so you can be guided by your appetites, your spirit, or your reason, your logos. And as we talked about this earlier, is more like your discourse. So you have some conversation going on in your head. You have an appetite for sleep, or for playing a video game, or for sex, or for something else. So you don't decide to go to class or to read for class or watch this video. And then your logos kicks in and starts talking to you inside your head. And you're like, no, you're not going to have time to get around to this later. You've got to do this now. You really should do this. So it overrides your appetite and it guides it properly. Your appetite for knowledge should be guided by your reason or your spirit. I want to go punch that person in the face because they just made fun of my girlfriend. Now I'm angry and I want to beat them up. But my logos or rationality says I should just make a quick quip and then we should leave or something like that. Because if I punch somebody, what if I get into a fight and they break a tooth? I don't have dental or health care. Well, I'll have to pay for that. What if they're underage and I didn't know it and they were like 17 and at a bar or something, and now I'm, I hit a minor and that's a terrible legal offense, or just in general, assault and battery is bad. Now I have to pay for lawyers and go to court and get bailed out of jail or something maybe. And that's assuming that that's the worst of it. They could kill me or something along those lines. Probably unlikely. Who knows? We're in a, stand your ground state. They might even have a gun or something like that, right? Who knows? You just don't. So my reason says, don't do that, even if they're making you angry. Try not to be violent unless it's absolutely necessary, right? Younger me might not have listened to the logos of that, but current me has got a lot of stuff to lose, and honestly, I don't want to bother with it because it's not generally worth your time. So I don't even really watch any sports, so I'm not entirely up with the, cheering and rooting for, whatever. But I do feel that when I play games, if I win, right, or if it's getting close to winning, I feel that sort of spirit, the welling up within oneself, right? I think that's a common feeling that people get, but it motivates you to activity, jumping up and down, screaming and shouting, to yelling at your opponent, right? Or jeering them, or rubbing it in their face, or whatever, right? Or your logos comes in and makes you a better sport, right? Or something like that. Because I mean, everybody seems to feel spirited when they win, if they care at all. So either it's some sort of voice talking in your head, kind of, hopefully giving you reason to action or activity, right? Oh, I should go talk to that girl in the bar. Oh, no, wait, I have a fiance I've been with for 17 years, so I'm not going to go do that. Oh, I really want to have sex with that person, so I'm going to club them over the head and drag them back to my cave like a caveman. No, rape, bad, not acceptable. Humans don't or are not supposed to do that. We actually do that a lot, but again, we've decided, because it's horrible and wrong, that we shouldn't do that. So your logos, even if you want to, because you are some sort of animal also, sorry about that. The deal is that your logos is supposed to kick in and tell you your reasons, your rationality, your discourse on why you should or shouldn't just follow your spirit and appetite. Now, Aristotle says that the animals lack logos. They have the irrational part or non-rational part of the soul. So they have the vegetative stuff that keeps them alive, and then they've got spirit and appetite. So like, good spirited dogs and horses and stuff like that. They've got a lot of run in them, a lot of fight or a lot of play in them, and they've got appetites for food and things like that. And depending on whether or not they've been trained properly, they will follow those all the way or not. Very hard to train a dog not to eat stuff off the table if you leave it alone, but they can be taught to do so, not through reason, because I don't think my dog's reasoning when he doesn't jump up on the table and eat the food. What I think he is doing, as Aristotle claims, is that he's having recollections of earlier incidents of when that happened, bad things occurred. So they have recollection and memory of pain or pleasure from earlier incidents, and that's how they operate, and that's all they operate, like mechanisms. However, humans have the extra added bonus of reason or rationality to help us do or not do certain actions, other than just saying, well, I don't want to do that again because when I touched the hot stove, it burned me last time. Now we reason, things that glow red are probably hot, and you ought not to probably touch that without having to have touched it before. Right? Reasoning, thinking things through, etc., and whatnot. And sometimes we don't even listen to that. Because, how did we figure out what foods were edible? Somebody had to try them at first, even poisonous ones. So, carrying on, these relate to, if you read the first book of the Nicomachean Ethics, the three chosen lives. Now, Aristotle says nobody chooses to make money. Money is a means, not an end. If you have to make money, that's only because you got it, not because you started off with a bunch. So the idea here is that if you had all the money in the world, or $1 billion, or whatever the amount is, that would mean that you wouldn't have to work anymore for money. In fact, considers it vulgar. All of his students, of course, like I said, were the rich elite Athenians who had not to work and had the leisure or luxury of going to school to listen to him lecture like you are being lectured to right now. And in fact, that's the whole term liberal arts comes from the word liberal, which doesn't mean like liberal versus conservative. It means liberal in the sense of free. Also, the word that is translated in the Gutenberg project for the Aristotle that I have is for generosity is called liberality, being liberal with one's money, being free with it, or free giving with it. But at any rate, the deal is this, that the liberal arts are supposed to be the arts that only a free man could afford to have, in both the monetary and in the time constraint understanding of the word. That if you don't have the time nor the money, then just learn a trade and be a slave. Right? Just learn something, make some money. It'll be fine. But if you don't have to do that, then what you should do is try to learn all of the different arts. And by arts, I mean crafts, knowledges, closer sciences, closer to the German word Wissenschaft, which means area of study, knowledge, discipline, or science. Wissenschaftlerin is a scientist in German, but also Wissenschaft means knowledge or discipline, or like philosophies of Wissenschaft, and so is the social sciences, right, or history, or sociology, but also chemistry, biology, physics, etc., right? All sciences. And when Aristotle uses the word science, that's what he means, the broader sense of science, not the STEM version of science that we currently have now. Okay, so mathematics
even is like sort of that. In fact, oddly enough, because math was the only exact science that they had at the time, the word mathematiko in ancient Greek means knowledge. That's literally the word for knowledge, because it's the only stuff that you have that's concrete. That's why I liked math better when I was a kid over this sort of stuff, because you could get solid black and white answers. But the further down the rabbit hole you go, even there you lose those. But not important for now. So these chosen lives, the life of pleasure, the life of politics, and the life of contemplation, relate to the three parts of the soul. If you are driven by your appetites, then you lead the pleasure-driven life, like a beast of burden or a beast in the field, and your happiness is derived solely from beastly pleasures. And Aristotle refers to this as vulgar and not befitting of a human. And the word vulgar literally it usually means to be crass, uncouth, or to have bad manners or to be discourteous or something like that, right? But vulgar actually literally just means common. When St. Jerome translates the Bible into the Vulgate tongue, what that means is that he translates it from ancient Greek and Latin into languages that are readable or understandable by people who don't have ancient Greek or Latin. As part of their languages. So vulgar just means, like commoners would do. Because commoners swear, commoners have bad manners, commoners are just common people, the hoi polloi, the herd, the masses, the sheeple. Oh, you wouldn't want to mix with them or be like that. Or be like a cow grazing in the field. They don't even have proper friends, they say. The cows are just near each other. Aristotle says a friend is not a friend like cows sharing a pasture. Or as Nietzsche points out, the cow is the happiest of all animals. He says this in The Use and Abuse of History for Life. It's one of the untimely meditations. He says, the cow is the happiest of animals. Why? Because the cow has no past to worry about, no future to dwell on or think over or think about. It lives always in the present moment and never thinks of the past or the future, chewing its cud happily, even getting onto that conveyor belt right up to the slaughterhouse, right? And if you ask the cow how it achieves such happiness, right, it would tell you thusly, but it would then forget, because forgetting is what is necessary for happiness. That's why children are happy, Nietzsche says, because they got nothing to worry about. They're being taken care of, at least most of them, right? They don't have a past they can remember, because I don't know about you, but there's a certain point in your memory where you just don't have any past that you remember anymore. Like, I remember when I was maybe 4 or 5-ish, but before that, nothing. I assume that's the same for all of you. And then, as a kid, you might have dreams about the future, but you don't really have to worry about the future or where your next meal is coming from or stuff like that most of the time. That's being provided for you because we're humans, and that's how we generally roll with children. Otherwise, they'll die on their own, unassisted, until at least age 7 or 8, for most of them, which also Aristotle claims is the age of reason, somewhere around 7 or 8. And the medievals thought similar things as well. At any rate, so yeah, forgetting is necessary for happiness, according to Aristotle. And children are happy because they do not have that it has been yet. And this seems to be true. But at any rate, you can't fulfill it, and it's no better than being a bestial animal. So he just goes ahead and says that's not going to work out. Plus, people that try to lead a life of pleasure standardly don't end up happy. So yeah, that's not reaching your telos either, your final goal, right? So, I mean, sure, the good life, the happy life, the eudaimonic, sort of eudaimonia, or the eudaimonic man or woman. I think that this can be applied to women, even though Aristotle doesn't. Is the type of person that's going to have a life with pleasure too, but it won't be their sole motivation or their driving force behind their life. Virtue should be pleasant, and having money is also pleasant, and having good food is pleasant, and sex is pleasant, and all these things are pleasant, but that's not what motivates or drives your life, right? Politics, on the other hand, in the broadest sense of the term, like social work or political work, on the other hand, he says even dumb people can do it. If you lack intelligence, you can find people that can help you, do this, but it's not self-sufficient enough because it depends on other people and your reputation and money. I mean, greater than 80% of all elections are won by the person who spends the most money. That has been true for almost ever, and especially in this country. In fact, pretty much the root of all evil in this country is campaign finance, and no one ever touches that once they get into office, because that's generally how they got into office. I mean, why don't we have socialized healthcare like every other first world country? Because the insurance companies spend more money than all of the other people who are donors combined, and that includes big pharma, on politicians. They give more campaign contributions than everyone else below them combined. And the second most giving people, we'll call them people since Citizens United did happen, right? It's the Supreme Court ruling that claimed that corporations count as people for giving money. Big pharma, like Pfizer and the rest of those people, they give more money than everyone else underneath them combined. So between the pharmaceutical companies and the insurance companies, they spend more money on our politicians than everyone else combined. And why would you bite the hand that feeds? Of course, campaign contributions don't sway people's votes. Obviously, that's not right or fair or legal or just, but let's be real, okay? That makes a big difference, and we're never going to get it unless the Supreme Court decides this is a constitutional right. Given the way the Supreme Court's being packed right now, we're not likely to see that happen, at least not in our lifetime, or at least not as long as the composure of our current Supreme Court is set up the way that it is. At any rate, but politics can help other people. It can help the greater good. And we, as social animals, want to do that because we are not like orangutans. Orangutans are pretty much the only great ape that lives by itself for most of its life. They show up and mate, then they part ways. The female has a child which it raises for a number of years, then they part ways, and that's pretty much the deal. And so it goes. Almost every other primate, all the other chimps and great apes live in social groups, usually small ones, sometimes big ones. The larger they get, the more violent they generally get too. By the way, like large packs of chimps go hunting other chimps even that are in their territories, and they don't do it when they need stuff. They do it when they have a lot because they just like to do it. It's pretty brutal. And look it up, seriously. There's some David Attenborough stuff on this, I think, somewhere on like Netflix probably. At any rate, but politics is something that we naturally are prone towards. And he says, even if you're not smart, you can find smart people to help you, guide you in your political campaigning career, assuming that you're at least that good of a politician. And then the life of contemplation, which he claims is the best because it's the most self-sufficient, requires the least of you, and you can do it the longest. So I need like a library card or internet access and some databases and a computer to type on, maybe just a piece of paper and some pencil, wax tablet, I don't know, whatever, something. I need time to think. I need a roof over my head, food in my mouth, and basically that's it. That's why I do this job, because I can do at least that minimum and still survive and do this thing that I'm doing here. So as a result, I choose the life of contemplation, even though it's not exactly making the big bucks. And again, like I said, even if you are a full-time faculty member and you are making the medium bucks, let's say, right? You know, averaging somewhere between 50 and 100K. That's pretty good money, in my opinion. I would be very happy with that. But for a lot of people, that's not considered a lot of money to make in a year. But if you make about 70K a year, you can send your kids to college, you can go on vacation, you know, you can live comfortably. But at any rate, also the life of contemplation, Aristotle claims, is the most divine, and it is the closest that we can come to sharing anything with God. And that he doesn't say until book 10. So if you missed that in book 1, that's because it's not there. He waits till book 10, the closing, the finale, the finish, to tell you why the life of contemplation is really the best. And it's not because I do it, it's got to be the best, right? Preaching to the choir. No, that's not it. He has a real reason for it. It does require less of you, but it does also require a type of person. Not everyone can be a contemplative. Not everyone has the natural ability to figure this stuff out. We're not all equal according to Aristotle. We're born differently. And some of us have better rationality or reason or logos than others. That should be abundantly clear to you by this point in your life, if you're watching this video, that some people are just naturally more gifted than others, and some people are smarter than others, and some people can do philosophy and other people cannot. And I'm not saying like can't do it at all. I mean, like, can't get to the higher levels and still grasp what's going on. Much like for me, for instance, I cannot grasp higher level math. And by that I mean I can do calculus, but I can't do Einstein level relativity physics. I don't know what an eigenvector is, and I probably never will fully understand what the hell's going on there. Okay, I'm just saying at a certain point my ability to know stuff caps out, and that's just all there is to it. Some people can't even get that far with the math, and that's fine. I mean, you don't need much more than you know, addition, subtraction, and percentages to be able to get by in life. I mean, you do need to know how to calculate percentages from your credit cards, your loans, and lots of other stuff. And adding and subtracting is important. So fractions, percents, that stuff, very important. Statistics, important. Calculus, unless you're an engineer, probably not going to use it. I mean, I went to a math and science boarding school and went from to Cal 3 and differential equations, and the most useful course that I took in math was still Introduction to Statistics, AP Statistics. Um, so, sorry, the math and science school called it that, even though it was AP Statistics. But regardless, the point is that that's come into handy way more times than calculus has for me. I've never had to figure out the dome shape or the area under the curve for anything in my general pursuit of life. Now, again, engineers do need to use this. People who construct things do need to sometimes use this. And people who conduct trains or figure out train schedules need to know stuff like this. But most of you won't. Still, the life of contemplation claims is the most divine. I'm going to pause again. I'm going to draw some more stuff on the board, and we're going to talk about God, the unmoved mover, for a minute, and why the life of contemplation is, in fact, the most divine, not just because he's a philosopher. Okay, and so for the final piece of this lecture, Aristotle on the unmoved mover or God. So as I talked about earlier, we have proximate movers, right? And the proximate mover is the thing that makes something happen exactly. So this is the efficient cause, right? That's the proximate mover. So we've got a chain of cause and effect, but really that cause was effect subprime 1, but really that came from cause subprime 1, which is really effect subprime 2, which really came from cause, subprime 2, sorry, and then which is really effect subprime 3, etc., so on and so on. And it seems like that would go on infinitely. And as I said before, infinite regress is one of our possibilities, but it's generally speaking considered very unsatisfying. It could be circular, which again, people tend to find unsatisfying, that it just goes around again and again. So maybe in science, when they talk about big bang, big crunch, big bang, big crunch, that might just be the infinite loop of everything constantly. And that it's just a circular thing. Although currently our physics thinks that it's going to be the big freeze and that everything is just going to eventually spread apart so far that it all just chills out and freezes, and there won't be there's not enough elasticity, I guess, in the universe to bring it back together again. But we don't know that for sure. Regardless, Aristotle says no to the infinite. He says eventually all of our proximate movers end with God. Okay? So that being the case, why? Why does Aristotle posit God? Well, he posits God to be a first principle, which he claims in the metaphysics is the most proper study in philosophy, to study the foundationless suppositions that we have, like energy or matter or life. What counts as alive? As I mentioned in an earlier lecture, life is still ill-defined. Is a virus alive or not? There's debate about that right now. We say that we inject you with a live virus and we're giving you a vaccine, but it's not technically alive by the standards of biology that we have come up with, right? So whatever we've defined it as, viruses technically don't count as alive. Look it up if you're interested. It's actually kind of interesting. So even in biology, you don't even know what life is. It moves on its own. Lots of stuff can move on its own. Or move, you don't even move on your own. You move because of your cells and because of the water you drank and the food you ate and the things that you were thinking and blah, 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 and neurons firing and electricity running through your body as a result of synapses and blah, 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 blah. Biochemical electricity and such, energy eventually or something like that. But we don't know what energy is. Or we have matter, we think. There's not actually good empirical evidence that there is anything as such as matter, but we'll talk about that later. Nonetheless, we claim that there is matter and that there is energy, but we can't tell you what that is. You're like, what? Something that has mass? I'm like, no, that is a quality of matter. Something that has a quantum of energy. No, energy is what measures everything else. In fact, it might all just be vibrating energy, but that's all we've got is energy and matter, and those are our axioms, our first principles. So in physics, that's what we study as the most theoretical stuff. Or what is a number really? What is one? What is oneness or two-ness or three-ness? What is it really deep down? There's an interesting book called, I think it's called Math Without Numbers, and it talks about the possibility of math even being socially constructed or culturally relativistic, which I don't think it is. I'm a relativist about most things, but when it comes to math, I end up being what they call a Platonist, which is to say that I think we discover things in math, not that we invent them. Pretty much everything else I think we invent or create as humans, but math seems to be one of those things that's just like laying in wait for us to find, like before we discovered calculus with both Newton and the philosopher Leibniz. They discovered it at roughly the same time. There's a big heated debate about it, who came up with it first, but it's probably they figured it out at the same time. They were using the same data sets from Descartes, also another philosopher. But at any rate, the point being is that calculus was always there, maybe, or did we create or invent it when those folks figured it out? Hard to say, but most people in math want to go with the discovery thing, and that math is atemporal, meaning it's not dependent on time. 5,000 years ago, 1 plus 1 equals 2. 10,000 years from now, 1 plus 1 equals 2. 1 plus 1 equals 2. I guess unless it's one line and one layout. But whatever. At any rate, so Aristotle posits God, the unmoved mover, as a logical starting point, as a first principle, as an axiom, as that which we cannot go behind. There is no answer to what came before God. It's just not. It's a non sequitur. It's a non-starting point. We can't do that. We just have to. This is the starting point. We decided on that by fiat. God, the unmoved mover, that which moved all other things into action, but itself is unmoved by anything else. That's all that we can do. So we have come up with a couple of qualities for God, right? Perfection and immortality, right? Timelessness, atemporality. Sorry, I can't spell it all. Einstein couldn't spell either, and I'm not comparing myself to Einstein, but smart people have issues with spelling too. It doesn't have to be. It just seems like one of those things that you get or you don't get eventually. And I am always bad with that. Plus, I'm dyslexic too, but that doesn't matter either. I mean, I've got a PhD there, and a degree from a fancy school there, and a master's degree over there, and I'm smart and I can do a lot of different stuff. But dyslexia is still something I got. But whatever. At any rate, and I can't spell worth a damn. And obviously, my handwriting is not exactly great. You guys are lucky I wrote this out in advance. So, at any rate, God, perfect, atemporal, right? Outside of time and space. Yeah. So, formal cause. That's it. He's the unmoved mover. He's perfect, and he is timeless. Also, due to the perfection, can anything limit God, or is God limitless, or boundless, or without limits? The answer we standardly say is yes. So there can be nothing that limits God. That will be important for later, but we'll talk about that when we get to the Stoics. The quick answer is that means nothing can be outside of God, including me and you and the wall and the air we breathe and all of space. So everything is God. This idea is called pantheism. Carrying on, we have a formal understanding of what God is. Now, the material understanding is there isn't one. God can't be made of matter because matter breaks down over time. Your brain stops working as well as it does. You forget things. You can't recall stuff instantly all the time. Even your mind, lacks some capabilities at some points in time. And everything breaks down. Everything has entropy. So if God was made of any sort of matter, he would break down too, or it would break down too, technically. I don't know. I can't recall if Deus is. I think Deus is gendered male in the language of the ancient Greek, but it's not that big of a deal. The gendering of different words isn't always. I mean, like, how do you gender a table, right? Whatever. At any rate, But God's definitely not something that's made out of material. So in that sense, we're not even going to be able to go with he or she on that, or whatever else you want to go with. Doesn't matter. They, their, etc. Efficient cause. God is its own efficient cause. Remember, unmoved mover. That's pretty much part of the definition, also formally, right? And the final cause, it's its own final cause. It's itself, right? It is what it is because it is. And it makes everything go into that. So now let's talk about some of those formal causes with the perfection clause in mind. Activity and actuality. So the ancient Greeks, along with most of Western philosophy and philosophers and people, think that activity is superior to passivity. Aristotle claims that activity is what makes us different than rocks or other things that don't move. And the more that something is self-moving, the more that it is alive. And we are some of the most self-moving things that there are. In fact, the slower something moves, the less alive we think that it is, right? I mean, that's just sort of the case. Even things like in our imagination, like zombies moving slowly, generally speaking, is sort of a trope. I mean, there are the fast-moving running zombies too, but like standardly, we think of them, the dead, as being slow, right, or something like that, or sloths. Literally, the name that we gave them is to be lazy, right? It's an animal, but it still moves slowly, right? Rocks and things like that. If it's like sandstone, builds up slowly and degrades slowly over time, things like that. So we think that things that are more active are more perfect, and things that are more passive are less perfect. And we are passive sometimes. We sit still for times. We sleep. We have to sleep. So we have to be passive and vegetative for about half of our lives. In fact, he has a funny little quote in the Nicomachean Ethics where he says, even the vicious person is, generally good for half their life because they're sleeping for half of it, right? So they can't be up doing vicious actions. He has some weird thoughts about dreams too, which I find kind of odd, because whether or not we count dreams as being virtuous or not, because would the virtuous person dream of vicious things or wrong or malevolent or evil things? It's kind of a weird sort of question. But with the truly virtuous person, actually, but he doesn't either. He doesn't give a good answer on that. He just says it's interesting to think about. So what do you guys think? Activity or passivity? We're going to assume that, like most of my classes, you say activity is better than passivity. It's better to be active than to be passive. All right, good deal. Then we have actuality versus potentiality. Is it better to have an actual dollar or a potential dollar? Is it better to be actually good at something or potentially good at something? Generally speaking, again in the West, with almost no exceptions, there's a few, but almost none, we prize actuality over potentiality, right? Yeah, potential energy is not as good as actual energy. Yeah, okay. Now, an aside to include Eastern philosophy, which we'll do a little of later in the course for intro. And what we're going to do here is that this is one of the reasons why Eastern philosophy is so divergent, and also the cultures are so divergent, is based on some of their epistemological and ontological groundings. And when I say ontological, I mean the study of being, on what we think things are, or whatever is, and what we know and how we know what we know. And when we get to that, in the Tao Te Ching, particularly, for Taoism, passivity and potentiality are considered better than activity and actuality. In fact, some of their religious symbols or signs are, in fact, about potential. The Pu, the Pu, and this is in Taoism or Taoism if you want to do the T. The Pu is the uncarved block of wood. And the reason that this is the one of their symbols is because the uncarved block of wood has the most potential, and therefore is the best. This is also sort of why humans think killing children is worse than killing adults. Aristotle doesn't think that, and neither does Kant. Both of them think that killing adults is worse than killing children, because adults have their rationality and are full grown and are a bigger loss than losing children. Now, again, you have to remember, we pride children way more than they did in a lot of ways, because they had a lot more child death in their time, and it was a far more common thing that happened. About half of your children would make it to maturity in the ancient world and the medieval world and the world before penicillin. So like pretty much any world that was before the last 200-ish years, your children would likely have not, half of your children would not have made it to adulthood. So they didn't value children nearly as much as we do now, because if your child doesn't make it to adulthood, or you end up burying even one of your children, people are extremely woeful. Not that they weren't then too, but like it's a big deal, and it's not the way things are supposed to happen, at least the way people like to think about it. It does happen, it can happen, it will happen again. But potentiality is considered more important in Taoism, and by Lao Tzu, who wrote, well, didn't really write it, but he was supposed to be the person who gave the inspiration for the Tao Te Ching. And that's, again, much like Socrates, he didn't write anything down, so we only have what people said he said. And then also the empty chalice is considered one of their other holy symbols, because it is the empty chalice which has the most potential to be filled. And then water is another one of their holy symbols, because while water is inert, it doesn't generally move on its own, and it can take any shape, like in a cup, or if I have it in a river or a reservoir, or whatever shape I want to put it in, I can do that, or I can freeze it or carve it into shapes, right? And while water, it seems inert and in general harmless, and it gives life, it is where all life has to basically have its stuff come from. Water is the most powerful force on earth. It carved the Grand Canyons. It can cause hurricanes that can wipe away entire cultures and civilizations, and floods. Even biblical style deluges can happen. Sorry, my dogs are barking. There must be somebody outside moving anywhere. They always bark. At any rate, so the uncarved block of wood has more potential. The unfilled chalice has more potential. Water, and is the strongest of all forces. Okay, but that's all Taoism. It has nothing to do with Aristotle. I'm telling you this because I don't want to disinclude Eastern philosophy entirely in your education of philosophy, because usually when we say intro to philosophy, what we standardly mean is intro to Western philosophy. But I actually happen to know a fair amount about Eastern philosophy too, so you're going to get a little bit. They also like passivity. There's this thing called the Wu Wei. It's waiting for the exact right moment to act. It's like creative inaction. I mean, it's like with Kung Fu, you wait for just the right moment to do the action that's going to make the other person, fall or be hit or whatever. In Judo, for instance, which I'm a brown belt in, or was a long time ago, I used to think a number of moves ahead. If I do this, he'll do that. And then if I step this way, he'll step that way. And then I'll trip him like this if he goes that way. And then if he tries to do that, I'll roll under and throw. And I always think a few moves ahead. And when I spar with my sensei, it'd be like I'd grab him and it'd feel like I'm wrestling with a loose coat, and then I'd fall on the ground. And I said, how many moves ahead are you thinking? And he said, that's not how it works when you get to a master level of this. It's no longer about moves ahead. And this is the same thing for chess and for the game Go, which is like chess, only far more complicated. And also Eastern, the Koreans are the best at it, nationally speaking. Japanese are very good, and so are the Chinese. But we barely even talk about it here in the US, but it's a really good game. Look into it if you're interested. Only very, very recently, I mean like the last couple of years, did we have a computer finally beat somebody who was a Go master. They thought that was impossible, much like they thought it was impossible for a chess master to be beaten, but Kasparov got beaten by Big Blue. Again, the reasoning is because the computer's computability is so much greater than ours that it was able to think too many moves ahead. But that's not the way chess masters and Go masters think, or the way that Judo, or the way that other sort of masters of this sort of thing. My sensei said you got to think about it in areas of strength and weakness, and they choose how they're going to be thrown, and you just respond or react to what's going on. Like water flows, and it takes the path of least resistance to wherever it's going to go, right? So passivity is a product. Now, forget all of that, because none of that is useful in the West. In the West, we say activity is more important and better and says what life is, and more appropriately shows what's good. Being active is better than being a lazy, lout, passive person. Screw all that potentiality stuff. I could have been a contender nonsense. Get out there and actualize yourself. And this is not about Maslow's pyramid of self-actualization. I hate that damn thing. It's not useful for what we're talking about here. Actualization is very important, and you are still potential as a human being until you are dead, and even then you have some potential as fertilizer perhaps, or for something to be grown out of or eaten, but you are always potential still. There is always still something left outstanding. There is still a yet to be for you so long as you are alive. So there is always potential in you for good, or for bad. Depends. I mean, you know, you have the potential to also just be nothing or no good, but you have potential to be great. Not anything, but a lot of things. So we're not fully actualized. We're never fully actualized for Aristotle as humans. We're always somewhat potential. Now, the philosopher Martin Heidegger is one of the people who says that potentiality is where we actually see our being the most and our not yet, in our futurity, in our, as Sartre says, our transcendence. Um, that is one of the things that we do, or as Heidegger calls it, our projection. Like when you have a projectile or a discus, there's a certain path that it's following, but it might veer in different directions, but it still has a path based on its history or its past or its facticity or its, you know, sort of stuff like that. So at any rate, the idea here is this, that actuality is more important. What you actually are, what is actually going on is the case. And activity is also the case. And again, you can't always be active. It's impossible. You'll burn out and you have to sleep. In the ancient Mesopotamian myth of Gilgamesh, it's one of our oldest religious myths and hero myths. Gilgamesh is a great hero who goes out in search of immortality, and he wants to defeat death. And he goes to the great sage Utnapishta and asks, Ut, how do I defeat death? And he says, well, first you must defeat his lesser brother, sleep. You cannot beat sleep, you cannot beat death. So then Gilgamesh tries to not ever sleep again. And as that may have happened to you at some point when you tried not to sleep, my record is 3 or 4 days. I was in a bet that we all pitched in money to a pool to see who would be the last man standing. I won. But at any rate, just coffee. So Gilgamesh eventually falls asleep, and Utnapishta says, how can you possibly think that you can beat death if you cannot even beat his lesser brother, sleep? So again, activity is generally considered our golden standard, and so is actuality. Now, back to God and perfection. How active is God going to be? Is God going to be 50% active, kind of like us, right? You know, you sleep half the time? No. God's going to be 100% active all the time, right? Because that's perfection. You can't be better than 100. Give it 110%, coach. No, you can't. It's impossible. 100% is set up so that that's the cap. That's it. That is as much as you can do, period. There's nothing beyond 100%, unless we do some other weird math stuff. But then even then, like really over 100% in your grade, that's because we're giving extra credit, which isn't right, because there isn't the extra in an actual percentage, because the percentage is part of a whole, and the whole is 100. Whatever. Carrying on. So how actualized does God have to be? 50% actual, 70% actual? No, God also 100% actual all of the time. All right. So now let's talk about it. What can God do if he's not material? You say anything. It's like, well, no, you need matter to do most stuff, right? There has to be some sort of material to do the thing. Or it could be thought. Thought seems to be the only thing that's not material. Now, some of you might be saying, oh, but synapses in your brain, neurons firing, and yada, yada, and yada, yada. But again, for Aristotle and for most people, they think that your mind and consciousness are distinct from your brain. That your brain or your mind are not, mutually exclusively the same thing, and that your mind or consciousness doesn't stop at your skull. Maybe it does, and maybe we're just throwing fairy dust into the system to try and make ourselves feel better as humans. But if we have a mind that is different than just our brain firing and functioning, or a person that's different than that, or consciousness that's different than just strictly speaking that, then that isn't going to be material. So if thought is our only immaterial action, and also the only immaterial action that God has, that is why when we think or contemplate, we are sharing something that God does, because that's the only thing God can be doing is thinking, because he has no material. And that's an activity. Thinking is definitely activity. It actually burns a lot of calories. It's odd. Your brain is extremely costly as an organ as far as calorie consumption is concerned. It burns a lot of calories to read and to think and to contemplate. That's why you feel exhausted after you've been sitting on your butt studying all day. It's not because you're like fatigued from just sitting there. You're fatigued because your brain has literally been working harder than usual and thus has burned a lot of calories. The reason why before we had good hospitals and good medical technology, a quarter of women died in childbirth was because our brains are so freaking big to start with that our heads have to be huge, and it makes it difficult for our giant head to get out of the birth canal properly without tearing the mother in twain and thus causing her to die a quarter of the time. No other mammals are like that. Most other mammals have pretty easy childbirth, and it's way lower than a quarter of them die in childbirth. For humans, we still have infant mortality rates that show up in countries, and we generally equate those to where there's better medical technology and first or second or third world countries. And by the way, we have a higher infant mortality rate than Cuba does, just so you know. And especially when it comes to poverty-stricken areas and for people of, guess what, color. All of those areas are much worse and gets closer to looking like third world country sort of stuff when it gets down to it, because they lack the healthcare necessary to make it more likely that they, have the prenatal care and the, doctors and proper hospitals and technicians and things like that to make sure that the childbirth goes smoothly. Regardless, thinking is the only thing that Aristotle says we share with God. And that's why the contemplative has the most divine life, because he is the one being the most like God, to be thinking all of the time. Now, the question is, what is God thinking about? Because for Aristotle, this is really important. You gotta know what God's thinking about, right? So, can God think about potential things or passive things? Because God, again, is not passive, so he's not going to be thinking about passive things, right? That doesn't make any sense. And God is fully actualized, so he's not going to be thinking about anything potential, right? So what has passivity and potentiality? Everything else, including you. God is not thinking about you for Aristotle. According to Aristotle, God doesn't care about you. God isn't God is just the creator. God is the person who kicks the domino chain off and no more. That's it. What is God thinking about? Itself. God is like a circle moving in it around on itself, thinking about itself 100% of the time, 100% about the most actualized thing in all of existence, which is itself. There's only one 100% actualized thing in all of existence. It's God, and it's the only thing that's 100% active all the time and never ceases to be in action. So God cannot care for you, cannot hear your prayers, cannot listen to you, is not concerned. In more contemporary times, we've referred to this sort of God, the God of Aristotle, or the God of the Peripatetics, which means the God of the walk-around people, which is what they called Aristotelians back in the day, Peripatetics, because they used to think and walk a lot. They say that he doesn't generally get a lot of worship, because why worship a God that doesn't care or doesn't listen? But I have learned this in my life, and I was raised very, very Catholic. God is not a magic genie, okay? He doesn't grant your wishes. And to think that God will is to also think that you know more than God if you believe in that kind of God. Now, Aristotle posits God as a logical starting point or an axiom or a first principle only. This is why he posits God. It's not because he wants to have there be an afterlife or somebody looking over your shoulder saying you did good or bad or something like that, or that was sinful or that was, pious or anything like that. No. None of that is what's going on for God. God is what our founding forefathers of this country, the USA, would have called deism. And most of our founding forefathers were actually deists. Now, Madison was very Christian, and there were a number of other people that were very Christian, but Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, George Washington, amongst others, all deists. They all believe that there is God, but God is just the person who kicked off the chain of events that caused everything to happen until now. And that God is not there to help you, assist you, guide you, or care about you. So Thomas Paine believed this very, very, he's the one who wrote Common Sense. It was famous and helped our revolution get underway. He wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson saying he was going to publish a book on deism. And Jefferson said to him, "Don't do it, man. If you publish a book like this, they're gonna hate you. If you tell people that you don't believe in a Christian God, it's gonna be bad for you." And he did anyways, and people hated him, and it went very poorly, and there were only 5 people at his fucking funeral. 5 people at one of our founding forefathers' funeral, 5 people for the person who wrote Common Sense. He was also part of the French Revolution and a politician there, not a very good one, but he was part of it. Okay, so after he got done with us, he went someplace else and then fomented revolution someplace else as well. Carrying on. Um, Thomas Jefferson wrote the Jefferson Bible. If you're ever interested, it's the Bible with Jesus in it, but it removes all of the miracle part stuff and all the magical stuff. It's interesting as a read if you want to look at that. At any rate, so Heidegger kind of puts it best like this. He says, the only reason that we care or have concern for anything at all, is because we know deep down that we're going to die. Spoiler alert, we're all going to die, okay? That's what makes us human. And that's the only reason that we care. Not care in the sense of, oh, I care so much about you, but care in the sense of give a damn. Otherwise, why would you bother doing anything? Properly depicted vampires in movies, I think, are the ones that when they get really old, they stop caring about things anymore because everything just dies around them and passes away, and they still maintain. So they stop caring, and they become cold, and they're just motionless in a lot of ways because nothing should matter anymore because it's all been done. It's all repeating. It's all the same. And if there's no end to it all, then why bother chasing money, women, cars, men, whatever it is that you, even knowledge. I mean, it doesn't really all matter if it goes on forever. I mean, what's the point? The point is that at some point you were going to die, and that's why you have to labor and work and do stuff, because you realize that there's a finite amount of time that we're going to be on this earth, and that's it. That's all you get. And he says that's why we have created time for ourselves as human beings through care due to our knowledge of impending death. It's also why children don't really care about too much, because they don't think about death. I mean, think about when you first thought about death. There might have been a death of a grandparent or a pet or something like that. But even when pets die, a lot of times they went off to the farm or something else like that. Or we sent the fish back to the river when we flushed it. No. Things die, and that's the case. Except God, right? Because He's perfect and atemporal and constantly active and 100% actualized. So Heidegger says that, and this was in a lecture, that if God truly was immortal and could never die, then He could never actually care. Because caring requires there to be a finite end, a completion, a real telos that isn't just yourself, infinitely spinning on its own wheels, thinking about itself. All right, have a good day. Oh, by the way, that's just Aristotle, not me. Don't blame me.